Attention!
There you go.
It is my pleasure this evening to introduce a very wonderful man. He participates with the archives in our research. He knows all the history of everything that's gone on. I think I should ask him some questions. Anyway, he wrote the Essential Ernest Holmes. He does a class on that. He has the Houston, Texas church. What else? There was 3 things. What?
I think you said the research team.
And research team. Anyway, he's a great guy, and I'd like to introduce Reverend Dr. Jesse Jennings.
I told Karen if I run out of steam, I'll throw it to her. Let's do another song. Isn't she fantastic? I want to thank her. The group that was on the screen who put this weekend together. All the people who've been thanked so far, I want to thank them many, many more times over. I want to thank my spiritual family of Creative Life in Houston, and especially those that made the trip up here, 2 of our ministers, 2 of our practitioners, and new friends that we're picking up along the way that we had dinner with last night. So thank you all so much for being here to support the archives and all that's unfolding. At our table, a compliment was paid to Dr. Sunny about what a nice crisp talk she gave and the number of points that she made and how she circled back and ended it in a timely manner. And I turned to the person sitting next to me and say, that's not going to happen when I get up there. So I'm just letting you know that in advance, but we're all checked in for the night, so we've got plenty of time. But I've got some stories to tell about the old days. And what I love about this particular assembly of people, just in the conversations that we've had so far, is that you know a lot of the people that I'm going to talk about. Because very often with a different audience, you get who? And it kind of saddens you because these were significant individuals in the life of New Thought along the way. And I want to pay tribute to one of them tonight who left the planet this week. And her name was Reverend Dr. Linda McNamara. Yeah. If you've had classes, any classes with CSL or its United Church of Religious Science predecessor organization, you have worked with something that she sculpted lovingly as in being involved in education for, I want to say, at least 45 years. And so she joins the ancestors tonight. And a part of her is in Building 100. A lot of us have teachers in Building 100. Often when ministers meet, at least this used to be the case in the old days, when New Thought ministers would meet, the first question you'd ask is not, what did you do before you were a minister, or where are you from, or the size of your church, your congregation. The first question was, who was your teacher? Who was your teacher? And we've all had many teachers, but we had one that stood out, didn't we? Might have been the first one, or might have been the best one, or it might have been the one who it wasn't famous, nobody's heard of them, and they maybe didn't, they weren't working in that place for a very long time, but they said something that clicked. They said the same thing that others had said, but they put their words together in a way like they were written in lightning, and all of a sudden the world made sense to us. Now here we sit tonight, and we're all dressed up, and we're all appropriate and sophisticated modern people, but one thing I know about all of us is that we were the kids who didn't fit in. Every last one of us were the kids who didn't fit in. Think about it. You and I sat there, and they were declining verbs and solving for X on the board, and we were looking out the window, trying to find a glimpse of the meaning of life. And then a hand, in my case a nun's hand, came slapping down on the desk. Pay attention. You're going to need this. I'm almost 70 years old. I've never needed algebra. Not one time in my life. Good, all right. If I ever do, I'll find somebody, or there's an app for that. But what I have needed is to know that I'm all right. What I have needed to know is that there is a ubiquitous divine presence in all people, in all conditions. That's what I have needed to know. And at the right time and in the right way, that message came to me. In my particular case, I was raised in New York City, and older people in my family discovered Raymond Charles Barker and Stuart Grayson. And I should mention that when I call names like this out in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to leave off the honorifics unless I forget to, or unless there's somebody like Dr. Dan, because Dr. Dan is not Dan. And never has been and never will be. He's Dr. Dan Morgan. So for him, okay, I'm going to make some exceptions, but others I'm going to skip that because I might get it wrong. And some of them aren't doctors, but they are reverends. And who cares anyway, right? Because we're all on a level plane in this. Well, they started attending at Alice Tully Hall at Lincoln Center, Dr. Barker, and then he retired, and Dr. Grayson took over for, well, there I broke my own rule, but I can't help it. I hear my ancestors in my head, telling me how this is. And then we were talking last night over dinner, and John Herron, one of our practitioners at Creative Life, he brought up, he said, Eric Butterworth was in another theater at Lincoln Center. He was in Avery Fisher Hall while Barker and Grayson were at Alice Tully. And he said that he heard a story, or you made it up, either way, it's a good story. He said that Butterworth and Barker met in the concourse there at Lincoln Center. And one said to the other, people come to your church for 2 or 3 weeks, and they think they've heard everything you have to say, so then they come to my church for 2 or 3 weeks. And I said, at the same time, there was a Church of Truth with Irvin Seal right there at Town Hall. And prior to that, there was Florence Scovel Shinn teaching at Steinway Hall. There's an incredible vortex of energy there. And this was what my family found. And so they came to me with it. I was a little kid in the 60s. And they came to me with it, and they said, you can change your life by changing your thinking. You can manage your destiny. You can, all this stuff they were hearing, all this stuff they were learning. And I didn't buy a word of it. I thought, no, what I need are mind-altering drugs. That will be, let's get in for that. So that will be my entry into a sense of the divine. And so I messed around with that for a while. And when I was, the year I turned 21, I joined religious science, but it was in Houston now, and it was a little bitty group. And my first teacher was somebody that very few people have heard of. His name was Ben Winter. Ben Winter's backstory was this. He'd come home from World War II. He was from Colorado. And somebody said, you need to go to the Aladdin Theater in downtown Denver and hear Orlando Wanvig speak. So he did. And he said, this is great. I want to know more. And he took some classes there. And then they said, if you want any more classes than this, you need to go to the Institute in Los Angeles. So I tell people accurately that my first teacher, my primary teacher was Ben Winter, and his primary teacher was Ernest Holmes. How cool is that, So who were your teachers? Who are the people who resonate in your mind? Who are the people that told it to you how it is and how it is for you now, and the determinations that you made in your life based on this knowledge? Now, we were coming up from Houston on Wednesday. We drove up here because on the way home we wanted to stop and see some sights. And we went through southeastern Oklahoma, went through most of Oklahoma and about half of Kansas actually getting here for one reason or another. And in Oklahoma, we passed through a little town called Chakotah in the Choctaw Nation. Chakotah is on the shores of Lake Eufaula. Is any of this ringing a bell? Which is an enormous lake. And on the shores of Lake Eufaula, there once stood a hotel called Fountainhead Lodge. And Fountainhead Lodge was enormous, and it's not what it sounds like. It wasn't rustic cabins and stuff. It was a big, ugly concrete, whitewashed hotel. It looked like a gigantic Bose radio sitting there on the shore. And that was where I went in June of 77 to the Central Area Religious Science Conference. Because we used to have conferences, United Church did, all across the country in the summer. They all eventuated at Asilomar in August. But starting in June, we had the Fountainhead Conference, we had Sand Dollar, we had Jekyll Island, we had Virginia Beach, we even had one up in the Poconos. And people would come in, just like here, from across the country, luminaries and practitioners and students and everybody together, and the occasional relative that got dragged along who didn't know what they were in for, but you got to sit through a week of this stuff with us. So at the event in 1977, I went, and when you find out when you're young in religious science, as some of you have been, they put you to work. You don't just go to an event, you staff an event. That's happened to a number of people here this weekend. You got here and now you're a volunteer, right? Yeah, I'll tell you what, one of the most esteemed leaders the CSL organization has ever had is tonight driving a golf cart. And you know, when they tell us that we began as practitioners, not as ministers, that the first subset, I guess, of the human family President New thought was practitioners, no, it was volunteers. We all started as volunteers wherever we were before we took class number one, you know. Well, I'm at this place in 77, and I was in awe because I was young, and all of this energy, and there's people coming in from all over. I'm meeting all of these folks. Al Hurd, do you remember Al Hurd? He was in Salt Lake City. He wore a muumuu. Johnny Reed was there from Shaker Heights. Ruth McDonald from Cleveland. Alma Stevens from Hollywood, Florida, all these, and then many, many people from Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and affiliated centers there, and not just United and so on. And people spoke, and they had workshops and all like that. And we had a banquet just like this, and at the banquet there was a keynoter, and the keynoter hadn't shown up yet. We were a day or so into this, and I didn't know the schedule, but the keynoter wasn't there. Well, they had an airstrip outside, so while we're sitting there eating, we hear, and a few minutes later, the door opens, and in comes this entourage with this man. People began to stand and applaud as he walked toward his table. He had piercing blue eyes. He had the most amazing jowls. He had such great jowls that I've determined I'd like to grow some jowls in my later years, you know. And he came in, and I said, who in the world is that? We need your help. Come backstage. Denise St. John it was. She says, we need you to pick this up, move it over here, and do this and that and the other thing. And we need to make sure that the red rose is on the lectern, as it always is when he speaks. The red rose. The red rose supernaturally appeared on the lectern whenever he spoke. And sure enough, I hadn't put it there. No staff had put it, but there's a red rose. And he had just flown in with his people. So how did it get there? We don't know. That was one of the signatures, I guess you'd say, of his work. The other was, he always wanted How Great Thou Art sung. But leave out the verse about when God, his son not sparing, sent him to die. He said, I don't want that. We don't believe that. Leave that out. And one time he spoke, and the singer forgot to leave it out. So you learn the song, and she sailed right into it, and everybody looked at him, you know. And he was so gracious about, that's beautiful, beautiful performance you just gave. This was Bill Hornaday. And I was in awe of this guy. I thought, man, a magical rose appeared. This is like Edgar Allan Poe's tomb, you know, with the half bottle of sherry, isn't it? How does this magic happen? I've got to know more about this. Later, what I learned was he's an ordinary human being. But he was a great spiritual genius. Not because he could make roses appear, and not because rooms full of people stood and applauded him, and not because of anything beyond the fact that he'd done the work and was continuing to do the work and was holding down Sundays at Founders Church and traveling across the country to speak, and he was teaching principle. He was teaching principle in this beautiful and elevating way. Well, he's gone now, and I don't know where his human remains were deposited. He could be in a columbarium at Forest Park, Glendale, next to Ernest. A rumor went round, started largely by Bill Hornaday, that when Ernest passed, there was a procession to the cemetery, and the hearse darted out of line and took Ernest off, we know not where, and he was buried in an unmarked grave someplace. And everyone went, what an humble man, what a beautiful story. And not a word of it is true. He's in Forest Park, Glendale, and there's a college. You can look it up. It's even numbered, you know. So Bill Hornaday might well be in the wall next to him. I don't know. What I do know is he lives here now. He lives here. His stories, his consciousness, the people that he touched, Dorothy Love, his assistant for many years. Arthur Chang is not yet off the planet. He was a classmate of mine. He has been at Founders ever since we graduated together, 1986. These amazing people, they've all come here. They'll all come here. We're here now, but we'll all come here with our writings and our teachings. We'll all fit into this place as the amazing bringers of light that we are in the world. When I first came to the archives in Golden, I made a fool of myself. To be honest with you, it's why I'm here tonight, to atone for that, in part. I lost my mind there. Kathy Mastroianni will attest to this. We're closing now. Sir, we're closing. Please put that down. Because I was, ooh, this and ooh, that. And I got what really until tonight was probably the greatest honor of my life, where they said, you know, every day or week, I'm not sure which, we turn a page in the 1926 textbook that's under glass. Here, put on these white gloves, and you can turn that page. So I did, and I got a photo of it, you know, and it's so sweet. And then I thought back, you know, just like the story about the hearse cutting out of the line and going off nowhere. Well, there was a rumor that went around, I don't know how long ago, but before everything was digitized, and the 1926 textbook was hard to come by. It wasn't in print. If you owned a copy, it was hardback, and it was one of the first editions, you know. And so amongst everybody else, a rumor went around, you know, Ernest didn't want to revise it. They made him. A bunch of people got together and browbeat. Can you imagine browbeating Ernest Holmes? Just sit with that a moment. Let's manipulate this man into something that he hasn't chosen of his own. But all the good stuff was taken out. All the good stuff was taken out, and it's in a file cabinet somewhere. It's like in the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. They put it in a big wooden crate and put it on a forklift and wheeled it down, right? And it's up on a shelf someplace. Not a word of it is true. And to see how mistaken that notion is, go look at the 1926 textbook and look at his handwritten revisions in pencil in his hand in that book, just as you or I would do. Say, I wish I'd said this differently. And some of these passages, you know, this might be a little advanced for the first-time reader, so let's put it in the home study course. And that's where it all went, the stuff that's not in the 1926 edition, which, by the way, is back in print under the same cover with the 38. But let's put it in the home study course. That textbook has a life of its own. That textbook, which has been a life raft for a great many of us. And, we complain about it. It's got stuff in there about digestive problems. You know, it's got, who puts this in their magnum opus of their spiritual work? This level of detail. But it's in there. But the story of this textbook and how it's moved. Look in the archives at those certificates on the wall. Look at these places that Holmes never visited. And the government of, Italy issues a proclamation. Some order of chivalry that you've never heard of makes him a knight because somebody got a hold of the textbook and read this material and said, you know what, this makes sense. This makes sense. This works. There was a woman who came to my center some years ago, and she attended the first time, and she came up, she said, I like this, I want to know more, you know. She came back the next week, the week after that, and about 4 weeks in, she came up and said, well, you're not going to see me for a few weeks because I'm going to go visit family. I'm going to California to visit family. We're driving out there, so it's going to take a little while, you know. So she gets to California and she visits with family, and her mother or somebody says to her, "Do you remember Aunt Minnie? Well, your Aunt Minnie would love to see you. I know you haven't talked to her in years, and she lives down in rural Arizona. So if it's not too much trouble, why don't you go out of your way?" And this woman was traveling with her daughter as well. She says, "Go down to rural Arizona. You could find it, and visit Aunt Minnie. Just drop in. You don't even need to call first. Just drop in on her." So Aunt Minnie was startled. Open the door, and there's, her niece and grandniece. And so they sit down and have coffee and such. And Aunt Minnie says, "So what have you been up to?" And the woman says, "Well, among other things, I'm developing a spiritual life. I've found this center, and they're teaching this material, and it's helping me," and so on. And, what's it called? She says, "Science of Mind." And she's probably thinking to herself, I don't remember, I'm inventing this part, but she's probably thinking to herself, this is not going to go well. Very often you tell you're into what now? And they start assembling an intervention, Aunt Minnie says, "I'll be right back." She goes to a bookshelf and she comes back with a signed copy of the textbook. Now, how does this happen? How does this happen? The thing has a life of its own. The thing has a life of its own. Since I have been here, since Wednesday night, this talk, it's like a bench with stories on it. And another story sits down and the first story falls off the end of the bench. So you've got a time limit. But of the synchronicities and the serendipities that brought us all together, how we found those teachers, how they found us. When, yes, the teacher's ready, the student appears, and vice versa. How this all happened is sheer magic. It's sheer magic. There was a generic term for all of us. Before we called ourselves, or at least contemporaneous with when we called ourselves unity people, or religious science people, or, well, before that, divine science people, or independent people. There was one term. We were truth students. We were truth students, and you'll see that in the old literature, especially the old unity literature. Now, that's problematic, because it kind of implies, if you don't buy this, you're trafficking in falsehoods, right? And it's got other layers of problematic meaning to it these days. But for us, it was true. For us, it was the only truth there is. We were the kids who didn't fit in until we found our tribe, until we found each other here, until we found that through our teachers, and until we found that through books, which Kafka called. He says, a book can comfort you, but the highest function a book can serve is to take an axe to the frozen sea of your soul. To take an axe to the frozen sea of your soul. A lot of us had given up on the idea of a divine presence. It belongs to someone else. I'm not worthy of it. I have a past, A lot of us had given up. I don't believe in a judging deity anymore. I don't believe in a masculine deity anymore. And there wasn't anything else around until something took an axe to that frozen tundra around our souls and said, no, there's more. There's more. And you know what? It's like that old story. They said when they hid the truth, when the gods hid the truth from us, they put it in the last place we would look, within. Because we've been all over the landscape, right? Lo here and lo there, but behold, the kingdom of heaven is where? Within you. The last place we look. I've been carrying it the whole time. In the S training, they used to have a saying, the light that you seek is in the lantern that you carry. So it's right there the whole time. And all of a sudden we discover it. And all of a sudden we realize, I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm thrilled that the archives has come to Unity Village. To be honest with you, when I first heard that news, part of me was saddened because I've seen a lot of change in the organization. I was part of this when we had an institute. You saw the picture of the place from 1935 when they moved up from Wilshire Boulevard to 6th Street in United and built, well, it was still one organization at that time, and they built I guess they didn't build it. They bought the institute. I don't think they built it, but they outwore it, I'll tell you that. Because in the 80s, it was falling apart. There was no money to fix up the plumbing and the electric and so on. And so the decision was made, not a bad decision, but the decision was made, we're going to tear the building down. We're going to trade the land for the money to put up an office building. And so that happened. And that's the Holmes Center you may have visited, a 5-story building next to it. Well, I was around when that was going on, and it was sad to see this place go, because that was, you got the archives here with Ernest's possessions and stuff. Ernest had an office in that building. So did Hazel. So did his mother, Anna. So did his niece. It's a family affair. Josephine Holmes Curtis, she was editor of Science Mind magazine, And all of these people, Gussie Rundell, who was Hazel's aunt. He made a funny story there. Gussie Rundell says, you might like my niece. She's recently widowed and she's traveling in Europe right now, but I have a picture of her. He put it on his mantle or dresser or something, and he fell in love with the picture before he ever met Hazel. And she came home. All of this history, all of this, the first meetings I attended, the first classes, the Ministry of Prayer was in a kind of a ramshackle building behind the Institute. And then the Institute went away and this building came up. And then after a few years, we were out of there and we were in Burbank and then we're in Golden. And so when I heard, it felt like a loss. It felt, we couldn't hold our own. I love unity, nothing against unity, but we couldn't hold our own. And I realized how wrong I am when I come here, not only because this place is beautiful and elegant, and they're going to take good care of it, and it's going to live here in perpetuity, just as this Unity Farm has. Not only that, but because all our ancestors are now side by side. He's next to Nona Brooks. Nona Brooks, he was a great friend of Nona. He's next to Agnes Gaylor, who ordained him. Ernest Holmes, before he was a religious scientist, he was a divine science minister. That whole racket is here. Everything, all of this is tied together in some way. All these people knew each other and did business together. And they all had a common vision. They were all about helping. They were all about serving. They were all about doing something great in the world together. Somebody else who lives here is Marcia Lehman. Marcia Lehman was my assistant minister for years. We were friends for over 30 years. She passed away in 2021. She would be here tonight at a table, scarfing down barbecue with all the rest of us. Where's she on the planet? She was phenomenal. So who was your teacher? Gene Amos was the person who brought religious science to Texas. Jeanette Kurtz was the person who brought religious science to Houston. They're here. Gene Amos became a minister, but for most of her career, she was a practitioner. And she was one of those people who just lit fires everywhere she went. There's a guy named William Miller who's here. William Miller was minister in, I think, Cincinnati. And he went around, he had this plan, and he went around to all these small southern cities, like Chattanooga, for example, or Huntsville, Alabama. And he went to these places in the 70s and 80s. And he'd rent a meeting room in a small, cheap hotel. He'd print circulars, and he'd get a hold of the Science of Mind and Creative Thought mailing lists for that area, mailing labels, and he'd invite all of those people out. And he'd have a 2 or 3 day seminar. And the first day and a half was teaching principle, and the second day and a half or 2 days was leadership training. And when he left town, there was a church there. There was a church there, and some of those exist to this day. Some have joined with others, and some have evaporated, into other scenes. But this was what drove him. It was as simple as that. Get a bunch of people together, tell them they're all right, teach them to tell each other they're all right, give them a few principles for financial management and how to create a center, an organization, and leave them alone. And watch what happens, and magic will happen. I called this talk The Corridors of Time, which is an expression Holmes uses more than once, and he means it principally as the universal subconscious mind. If we could walk down the halls of time, corridors of time, we would see illustrated the beliefs of the species, all of the past, all of the contents of consciousness, collective consciousness represented for us. I love to look back. I love the history of all of this and where it came from. But every time I look back, I have to look further, because I like, 19th century, the drill, New Thought, Emma Hopkins came out of Mary Baker Eddy and so on, and all of this. And then, you go far enough back, see what's over my head up there? That's from the Temple of Dendur. The Temple of Dendur stands in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The winged globe is the insignia of unity. It was one of their first insignias. They still use it, obviously, as it's there. And it symbolizes the home of the gods. The Temple of Dendur was from the 1st century BCE. It was dedicated to the goddess Isis, but all the deities, including Ma'at, the principal consciousness deity of Kemet, or ancient Egypt, all of the deities live there in that place. New Thought is ancient wisdom, and that ancient wisdom continues through each of us. I think that's enough stories for one night. So now I have an ask. Now I have an ask for you. No, I got one more story. I just saw this. But I'll be brief. Because I hadn't planned this one. Stuff happens. You know what I'm saying? It's like the synchronicities and all. So we go in the archives. As I say, I'd been to it in Golden. I go in the archives here. What's the first thing I see inside the door? What we believe, right? Framed and hanging on the wall, on actual sheepskin. I know who created that. That was Gary Lister. Gary Lister was head of Science Mind Publications back in the day. And this guy knew merchandise. So he went out and for about $50, which was a lot of money in 1980s, for about $50 you could buy that parchment unframed. So I did for my center, which was just starting out. And I took it to a frame shop. And I dropped it off, and they said, well, it'll be a couple of weeks. And I came back in a couple of weeks, and the owner of the frame shop came out. The person working the counter was preparing to conclude the transaction, and the owner of the shop came out and kind of stepped in, looked me right in the eye and said, what is that? What is that? And I told him. And again, you never know what kind of reaction you're going to get. Get out of here. You're pagan material in my... He said, that's exactly what I believe. Who are you people? And all he had to do was look at this and read it himself. Nobody standing over his shoulder, nobody coaching him, nobody wanting anything out of him. And he never showed up. He never showed up at my center. It was a Jewish guy, as it turned out. He had his own spiritual practice, but boy, did this help. And that's what Ernest Holmes intended. That's exactly it. When he first started speaking in L.A., it was like, I don't care what else you believe, this will help. Do you pray? Then if you pray, try believing in the words that you're saying. Not only that, but take it a step further. Try believing that the words that you are saying are manifesting as you say them. And take it a step beyond that. Try believing that the words that you're speaking have already manifested in the non-physical realm and are about to be around the next corner that you turn. And if you will do that, if you will believe and not doubt, if you will believe, something amazing will happen. And it has happened, hasn't it? It's what brought us all here tonight. So last week being Easter, I was thinking about Jesus. I can't help but think about Jesus at various, not just Easter. I'm not just an Easter Jesus person, but I'm not at all a Christian, at all. But I do believe in Jesus, and I believe in his teaching. And everybody enthuses over the 18 years that he was off the grid. But you know what gets me is the 40 days after the resurrection when he came back. And I would have been so out of here, and so would you, after the kind of treatment that he got. But he came back for 40 days, and he scared the daylights out of the disciples. And you know why? Because he wasn't done. He had stuff he wanted to say, and he wasn't done. So that's where I want to leave it with. These people aren't done. Building 100's not done. They're not all just sitting there gathering dust. They want you to read them. And that's the ask that I have for you. That's the big implore for you as you come here. You are tonight at a gala. That's from the ancient Greek for fundraiser. And I have a pocket full of raffle tickets to prove it. Not that I'm selling, but that I bought. And I know if I win, because I'm the keynoter, you're going to say the fix is in, just like I told John, the fix is in if you win, buddy. But my ask is not for money, although it's vital that we support the archives. It's vital that we support Science Mind magazine. Vital that we support Science Mind. Vital that we support CSL and our home communities and everything else. But my ask is this. There's one thing I'd rather do than teach, and that's learn. And that's learn. So I implore you, study what's in the archives, actually or virtually, physically or digitally. Study what's in there. You'll find people you never knew existed. You'll find people you did know saying things you'd never heard. And you've been through that book, just like the experience you've had with the textbook, right? Every time you pick up the textbook, it's like, no. I've been to page 412, and that wasn't there last time. But now it is. I studied Emma Hopkins students, who are the founders, as you know, of New Thought, and a lot of other people besides. I found a woman named Frances Lord. I lost my mind over Frances Lord, and now I'm tripping off on her, and those of you who've had classes with me have had it up to here with hearing about Frances Lord. But it's good stuff, because she's saying the same thing, but she's saying it in a way that I hadn't heard before. So it's lighting me up. So I implore you to study this material. That's how we keep the archives alive. It's not just funding it. It's not just making sure that the room is well kept and there's volunteers on hand and, all the rest of it. It's logistical and kind of allopathic that we're aware of, No, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that, about carrying it to the next person that you're going to meet in your life. Okay, last line for me on this. There used to be a column. I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but there used to be a column in Science My magazine called I Refuse the Verdict. And in there it had where you'd be sitting, a person commuting home from work was sitting on a train. And somebody came and sat next to them and said, I hate my boss. I have a miserable job and this awful commute, and life is just terrible for me. And our hero in the story would turn to that individual and say, have you ever thought about changing your attitude? You ever thought about changing your attitude? And the grumpy commuter, all of a sudden, is like, well, okay, I'll give it a shot. And everything blossoms and everything blooms for them. We never know when we're going to turn the next corner and find our teachers, but we also never know when we're going to turn the next corner and find somebody who doesn't fit in and really, really wants to, and wants an entry by way of you saying what you know, telling it to them in a very level, common sense, conversational kind of way, so that they can go cogitate on it and come to their own conclusions. And the next time we all get together, there'll be twice as many people here doing powerful work. I want to thank you so much for your kind attention. I want to thank the archives staff and everybody who went, put it all out there, left it all on the floor for this weekend. Thank you all so much. Good night.